What can 20 years of targeted removals do for CWD prevalence?
Well, that was a question we talked about when we just had on Kip from the NDA, and found out really it helps. There's a comparative analysis, and maybe you can talk about that a little more. I thought that was an interesting one that I was not aware of.
Yeah, I mean, apparently it makes all the difference. So we talk about targeted removals, some other things that maybe are a little unpalatable to hunters, but can be critical in the fight against this disease.
Yeah, and so we had Kip Adams on. He is the Chief Conservation Officer for NDA, and been in the fight for a long time, avid hunter himself. And we talked about all kinds of things. Hunter behavior was a huge kind of theme within this. Like, what do we do as hunters? What have our behaviors done to either help or hurt CWD transmission? We talked about interstate transport of captive cervids, a lot of different things with a little bit different perspective than some of our other guests. So I think there's a lot there folks are going to be interested in hearing.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good listen.
Well, awesome. Check it out. Kip Adams from the National Deer Association. Chronic wasting disease, an always fatal and definitely complex neurological disease afflicting cervids across North America and beyond.
More than 50 years after its discovery, the impacts of this disease are ramping up quickly, while hunters are having to make tough decisions about how they hunt and feed their families.
What does this mean for the future of big game hunting? What can be done to stop the spread and conserve our hunting traditions?
The Chronic Wasting Disease Chronicles explores these issues with leading experts from around the country and looks hopefully to a future full of healthy, wild cervid populations.
Brought to you by NWF Outdoors and Artemis. Welcome to the Chronic Wasting Disease Chronicles.
Hey everybody, today we are sitting down for this episode of the CWD Chronicles with somebody that I know is a great voice for hunters. Kip Adams of the National Deer Association is joining us today to talk about everything that NDA does and has done around CWD, and kind of do a deep dive into what the state of affairs is for hunters and what they can do in terms of the disease. So Kip is the Chief Conservation Officer for the National Deer Association. He, in his past, he is a certified wildlife biologist. He's served as a deer biologist. He's got multiple degrees in wildlife and fisheries science. I know he's a longtime deer hunter and an all-around great guy. So we're excited to have him on. My co-host today is Aaron. Aaron, how you doing?
I'm doing excellent, Ashley. Looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for coming, Kip, sorry.
Yeah, Kip, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, and I appreciate the kind words you said about me. That all-around good guy thing is that's very nice. That's a nice touch. So I'm glad to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, so let's jump right in. Can you give our listeners kind of the short and sweet version of what the National Deer Association does, who they are?
Sure. We're a national nonprofit wildlife conservation organization with a mission to ensure the future of wild deer, wildlife habitat, and hunting. And so we take it upon ourselves to make sure that we have healthy deer populations, that hunters have the ability to go afield after them, and that there's places that they can go and they have access, to have hunting opportunities, to be able to bring venison home. So we're kind of guardians of the deer, if you will. And we look at disease, we look at nutrition, we look at good management programs. We kind of oversee all of that and take a close look and really monitor that from a state agency perspective, from a federal agency perspective, and private landowners. So certainly the disease end is really hot today, and we spend a lot of time monitoring CWD and anything else that impacts our wild deer.
Yeah, and so I feel like you come at things from a science perspective, which is really important, I think, and also from a I mean, from a landowner or a hunter's perspective, like it's kind of the marriage between best practices for management and also the desires of hunters. Because I think, as all of us can agree, without hunters, there probably wouldn't be deer. And so it's important, I think, to serve both sides of the coin.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we're in a unique position because we have great working relationships with all the state wildlife agencies, with many of the major academic institutions that study deer and study wildlife habitat. So we're in a unique spot where we can take that information and get it right out to the hunters, to the landowners, the folks that could really apply that, and just have an actual on the ground footprint with regard to managing habitat and having healthy wildlife populations. So we like being in that position, and well, we feel that we're doing a pretty good job with that. Just given how healthy many deer herds are today, and how much more private land is managed, for deer and other wildlife species. So it's a fun place to be, actually.
Kip, I appreciate that. And why we're here obviously is to talk about CWD. And so let's just start broadly. How do you rank CWD as far as in terms of its ability to impact herd health and hunting? I mean, that we're all here because we care about deer. Let's just talk about, your professional opinion, how it's looking.
Yeah, we look at CWD as the biggest thing impacting the future of deer herds right now. It's bigger than hunter numbers, certainly bigger than the anti-hunter movement. It's even bigger than habitat loss. And that's not just us. The vast majority of wildlife professionals see CWD, as that big of a threat. So we're firmly entrenched in learning all we can about it. We're firmly entrenched in doing what we can as an organization to share information with hunters and other managers, to be able to fight this disease every single day. So we know there's naysayers out there, but it's very clear that anybody who really looks at this, they understand the severity of CWD.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, what is it? Just in the last month? I mean, maybe it'll be a little bit longer by the time this episode airs. We've got two states that have now popped positive here in the Southeast. That's close to home for me. It's tough out there. I mean, I feel like for a while I've been telling people, if you don't have CWD, you probably will in the not too distant future, which is terrible. But yeah, I don't know, maybe you can speak to kind of some of your constituency and how you feel like, obviously if they have CWD, it's right there in their face. But for folks that hunt and live in states that haven't yet tested positive, I mean, what are words of wisdom or anything that you have to say to them?
I think that you're right with that, Ashley. There's a chance they're going to have it. So what we tell people is do everything possible to keep it out. If it hasn't been identified there, lucky you, and hey, let's keep it that way. And there's things that everybody can do to help keep it that way. So yeah, we let them know the main ways that the disease can spread, and things that they can do to help fight it. And some get discouraged and think it's all bleak. I don't believe that at all. There's absolutely things that everybody can be doing on a daily basis, whether you hunt deer or not, or you're just a wildlife enthusiast, to be able to keep the disease at bay, or if it is in your area, to keep it from spreading.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about that. I mean, we've talked so far on the podcast about the importance of having, your harvested deer tested for CWD, of course. I know that it looks different in different states as far as the ease of having that done and the cost associated with it or not. But what are some of the things that you would tell people are most important, as a hunter, as sportswomen and men, that they can do in the fight against CWD?
Well, we know that the disease can be transferred in several different ways. Deer can give it to other deer through urine, blood, saliva, feces, semen. But there's really two big ways that it moves the most. And so, as hunters or as just a wildlife enthusiast, if we literally can do these two things, if we would stop moving live deer and stop moving the high risk parts of deer that we shoot, we could dramatically reduce spread of this. And what I mean by the high risk parts are the prions in the deer, they accumulate in certain areas. So those high risk parts are the eyes, the brain, the spleen, and the backbone. And that's why so many states now, don't allow you to move those parts. They make you debone that meat before you come out of a disease zone or before you cross a state line. So, some hunters look at this and say, man, that's a big inconvenience. And I'll be the first to say, sure it is. But you know what? Deer are pretty darn valuable. So it's an inconvenience absolutely worth doing. If it takes a little bit of extra time to go ahead and debone it, hey, if you want to safeguard the future of our deer herds, that's certainly well worth doing, in my opinion. So if we just simply do those two things, actually, we can really limit the spread of this and allow the science to catch up and figure or give us a way that we can beat this disease.
Kip, you're obviously a species specific organization you work for, right? And so some of the folks we talk to cover lots of different wildlife and, our broader spectrum, but you guys are the experts on deer. Can you talk to us a little bit about, NDA's approach specifically, what you've accomplished, what you hope to accomplish, what your goals are within this fight?
Sure, we want people to understand as much as they can about the disease, but then also understand as much as possible about just simply the value of deer. If you take a look across the United States right now, only about 4% of the public buys a hunting license. So we're not going to solve anything with 4% of us. So we are firm believers that, to really beat this, we need the other wildlife enthusiasts out there that don't necessarily buy a hunting license or maybe don't hunt deer or maybe don't hunt at all, but that like deer. They like to see them. They like to photograph them. They like to know that they're there. It's going to take that group of people to really beat CWD. So what we do is, we teach our members and everybody that does hunt or care about deer what they can do, but we try to take that next step as well and just ensure that the general citizenry of the United States understands more about the true value of deer. And you don't have to hunt them to understand that. We know that the majority of our wildlife funding for all of our state wildlife agencies comes off the backs of hunters. The vast majority of those are deer hunters. So, a deer hunter, by buying his or her license and purchasing equipment to go, helps fund, much of our non-game wildlife programs, our songbird programs, our herp and reptile and amphibian programs, all that stuff. So, there's a lot of things that deer enthusiasts can help. So we make sure that they understand that and the importance that they have in this.
Awesome. I appreciate that. One of the things that we think about kind of all the time is how to activate, the other folks. That's kind of our biggest thing, because as you pointed out, very, very obviously, if only 4% of us are hunting these and are the diehard enthusiasts, right, then we need 96% of those other folks to get engaged. Do you have any, unique strategies or things that you've utilized that you're like, wow, this is working and this is helping, people beyond the deer hunting community get engaged on this issue?
I think as much as anything is if we just need to let them realize, really what's at stake. And we can be so specific about the type of wildlife that we follow, whether, we're an upland bird hunter or we're a birder, and we watch songbirds. So we kind of forget how they're all intertwined. And one of the things that's interesting about, our organization, we work with deer, is that deer are a keystone species and they impact, so many other wildlife species out there. So we try to help people realize, hey, if you do good for deer, you're not only helping deer, you're helping all this other stuff. And conversely, if you don't do good for deer, you're not only hurting deer, but you're hurting all these others as well. A great example of this is Joe Hamilton, who's the founder of the QDMA. And, Joe is revered by many, as the person that almost single-handedly changed how we hunt deer and how we view deer today. And but I will say this, I've been lucky to spend a lot of days at field with Joe. He is the most ardent birder I have ever seen. He can identify more songbirds by sight and sound than anybody I know. And, if people who don't know him, they look at him as a deer guy, but Joe understands how everything fits in together. And so I've always kept that at heart. And, when I'm working and teaching people, I try to make sure we impress upon them that. And so I think that's pretty special about, Joe and our organization, but anybody that cares for deer. I think it's pretty neat, that they're taking care of a lot of other things out there as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Go ahead, Aaron.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of reiterate your point, man. Every sportsman and sportswoman I know, all the diehard hunters, man, they have such an appreciation beyond just what they're pursuing. I mean, I'm a big birder myself. I know a lot of people who, some of my favorite hunting partners are birders, and people who just like, I get caught up in following a turkey track or a or a bobcat or something when I'm out hunting a lot of times. And I've even done it to the degree that I'm like, hey man, I better get back on track. I'm not out here for this right now. But just that love of wildlife, I think that's a little bit lost sometimes with the general public from the sporting community. And I know we do a lot to try and enhance that, right? And to try and tell folks that story and bring that hunter knowledge about the landscape into other issues. Because I mean, whether it's like we work on climate, we work on, infrastructure, all different kinds of things. And if you think about the knowledge that someone has that goes to the same landscapes year after year and sees these changes and sees these things, that's kind of, not matched by anybody else out there. So I appreciate you pointing that out. And I think it's the same thing with CWD, right? We have to have hunters, and it's going to take that group telling and educating and showing the rest of the folks what we have at stake here. So I just really wanted to put an emphasis on that point.
Yeah, I think it's especially important here today, given that we're more of an urbanized society than we've ever been in our history. More of us live closer to urban centers than in rural areas today. And you take a look at a lot of the people in those environments, and they either don't have that connection to deer, or what they have is negative. They think about, geez, I have Lyme disease because there's deer here, or my gosh, we hit another one, in our suburban neighborhood with our car. So, they may love birds and they may love the squirrels that they see and all that, but they don't understand the connection or how deer helps them. So I think, that challenge that we have is more important today than ever before to share, the true value of deer, whether you live in suburbia or, rural America.
Yeah. And I think trying to underscore or further explore that funding umbrella, right? Like if we think about deer as by way of license sales, funding the vast majority of wildlife management that can happen at the state level, the converse is also true, that CWD, the management of it, the prevention of it is just sucking agencies dry. I mean, it's a huge drain on resources. And I think we've talked about that a little on the podcast, but, it comes down to, the cost of testing, staff time to collect samples and to do surveillance and, outreach to let people know how to submit samples and what the new regulations are. And I don't know, I feel like that's kind of a hidden cost that we don't think or talk about a lot. But it's, again, impacting everything from, songbirds to you name it. It's really a drag.
Yeah, if you take a look at any new state that when they first find the disease, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of a $250,000 bill between increased testing that's a result of it, increased monitoring, surveillance, et cetera. And, it's not like agencies are flush with money in most cases. And there's not a pool of money that they have, oh, you have CWD, now here you go, here's this to pay for it. I mean, there's essentially no federal funding for it, which kudos to you guys for talking with Representative Kind, on that CWD bill and trying to get that. So, yeah, agencies, it's good that they are testing, and thank God they are, but it's not like there's a pool of money that comes from. So other wildlife programs suffer, like access, like habitat management, land purchase, et cetera. So it's a big deal. And I mean, look at Wisconsin. Wisconsin was the first state east of the Mississippi River to get the disease, and in fast forward 20 years, they spent over $50 million, on trying to monitor and it was surveillance. So it's a big price tag for sure.
Let's get into some of that nitty gritty, Kip, because I mean, I think that's where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, what do hunters need to do? What behaviors do we have that maybe have to be altered? Things like that. We hear things like herd reduction and baiting bans and controlled removals, all these things that are like, most of us are going, oh gosh, what the heck's that going to look like? And that's scary. So, there's a couple new states, they're going to start probably looking at, the same kind of things, herd reductions, maybe baiting bans, and hunters often oppose these actions. Let's talk about those and what you would tell a hunter when they get the news that, hey, we're going to do some herd reduction over here, or, you're going to have to change your behaviors. You're not going to be able to bait. You're not going to be able to do some of these other things that, some hunters really like to do.
Yeah. What I tell hunters is, hey, let's just step back and take a look at what really are the implications to us now. And the thing that hurts the most is that as a hunting community, we often are very traditional. Like we like to hunt the same days. We like to go to the same spot. We like to be at a hunting camp or a hunting club with the same people. So anything that puts us out of that routine, in general, we tend to oppose that. And man, CWD really puts us out of that routine. So I get it. I totally understand that. So I try to tell folks, all right, let's just take a look at what the actual implications to us are, and see what we can do to do our part to help this. The first thing is almost always, hey, let's reduce deer numbers. Our agency will say, even if that deer herd is in balance with the habitat, let's reduce those numbers. Because the one thing we do know is deer can share this with other deer that it come in contact with. And that's one thing that's unfortunate about this version of the prion disease. The version in cattle, they can't give it to other cattle. So man, I wish deer couldn't give it to other deer, but since they can, let's reduce deer numbers to help limit some of the spread of that disease. And immediately, hunters will say, I don't want this because, you've never heard a hunter say, man, when I go today, I hope I see fewer deer than I did yesterday. We don't say that, right? We say, man, I hope I see more deer than yesterday and more than last week. So, is it a good strategy to reduce deer numbers? It absolutely is. And this is coming from a diehard deer hunter, that I love to see deer and I want to see a lot of deer when I hunt. But we need to reduce deer numbers simply to keep some of those deer from congregating and sharing that disease with each other. And we do know for a fact that if we can reduce them, that we can definitely slow the spread of this down. So, does this have to be that way forever? No, not at all. If you allow the disease to continue to spread in that deer herd, it will be that way forever. So if we can have a little bit of an inconvenience now, let's accept the fact that we will see fewer deer, in the short term to make sure that we have healthy deer in the long term. I think that's well worth doing.
I like what you said, Kip, about hunters being creatures of habit. I can certainly identify with that. And I know that hunting, not just deer hunting, but certainly deer hunting, is a very cultural phenomenon, right? Like if you learn to hunt from your dad or from your mom, it's a family thing. It's kind of a lot of those traditions are passed down. So it can be hard to pivot, especially when it's not by choice, right? Like when there's new regs and you're having to kind of be reactive that way. But one of the things I think about a lot when I think about this and talk with other people about it is deer hunting has not always looked like it looks today, right? Like it's changed a lot over just, if you just think about like European settlement here in North America, through that whole timeline, things have looked very different. I know this isn't related to deer, but when you think about duck hunters of old with punt guns, going out in a boat and just shooting at a flock of ducks with this basically huge cannon and dropping, 100 ducks, like that's crazy. We wouldn't even call that hunting now today. So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I think there's room for new traditions to be made, and thinking that just because something has been done one way forever, quote unquote, which might just be 3 generations, it's not impossible to change.
No, you're absolutely right. And, the hunt or the deer numbers thing, that's certainly a big one because regardless if you hunt, by yourself or at a camp or whatever, we want to see deer. So I get that. There's other things that impact some of the traditions that we have once CWD arrives as well that hunters can be a little averse to. Things like, having to have your deer tested. You have to take it in some states to a check station. In some cases, you go home with a headless deer because they keep the head, and a non-hunter probably looks at it like, well, what's the big deal? But to a hunter, that can be a big deal. Or maybe your significant other is not a hunter and you come home with this headless animal that suddenly you may understand as a hunter, well, I left this for testing. But if you're not a hunter, that can be a pretty stark image to see that. So, there's a lot of smaller pieces like that do affect hunters in these CWD zones that I think it's good to talk about. I think it's good to make sure that, that they're exposed to these and are aware of them, and just understand that by doing this, you're going to help the future. I'm always trying to make sure to impress upon them, hey, we're not just thinking about this year, next year. We're making sure we have healthy deer, 5, 10, 20, and 50 years down the road. So these are some of the things we have to do in the short term to make sure that we can have that.
Let's talk about a couple other things with that, Kip, because, hunter behavior determines so much of this. And so obviously we want to drill down on a couple of those things. And, one is like baiting and feeding, right? Congregating deer. if you bring them in and maybe they congregate in abnormal numbers, obviously the propensity for CWD to spread. I mean, logic would tell you it's true, and then I think we've proved it. If you're concentrating deer too, it's a problem. What do you tell hunters about that? Or, besides what do you tell hunters, but also, what should we be doing about that with some of these traditions? They're traditions. You might have 3 generations, like we've talked about, of folks who've been putting out salt licks or feed stations in certain places. How do we get them to start buying in and thinking about different ways to help control the spread?
Yeah, boy, that the whole baiting and feeding issue, man, that runs deep in the hunting community, really, really deep. Um, with that one, there's a lot that we don't know about CWD. One of the things that we do know is that CWD and other diseases are much more readily spread at sites where deer are swapping saliva, at bait sites, at mineral sites. So we can argue, the ethics of feeding or baiting, and that in my mind has no bearing on this as a disease, because the science is very, very clear that when those deer are mouthing, the same spot, that the disease or spread increases. So, some folks will say it's totally fine to bait, and I won't debate you on that, whether ethically that's right or not. But I certainly can debate you that, man, from a disease standpoint, that is not a good thing. So I think anywhere there's the disease, there should be no baiting, there should be no feeding. We can do a good job making sure that we provide adequate nutrition through good habitat management. With that, we don't need to dump it out of a bag and have deer eating right on top of each other. And this is coming from somebody. I have been in states where feeding was legal. I've been in states where hunting over bait was legal, and I have done that. So I'm not some purist by any means. I'm truly looking at this from a disease standpoint. Of the different ways that deer can shed these infectious materials. We talked about urine and feces and all that. It's extremely, extremely unlikely that a deer that has a disease will infect another one through the urine. It can happen, but it's very unlikely. For saliva, that's much, much different. So when deer are at these mineral licks and bait sites, they are swapping saliva on a pretty regular basis, because once those materials are on the ground, in some cases they can be there months or even years and still infect deer that come in contact with them. So the science is very clear on that part of it. So yeah, I think they all should be outlawed if you're inside a disease zone.
So, Kip, do you think we should be going for just a widespread kind of ban of feeding and baiting type stations? I mean, do you think that would really be a tool that would really slow the spread if we did that? I mean, obviously we want to keep states' ability to manage deer, and rather than a federal rule, I think a lot of people would have heartburn with that. But is that something that would be an effective strategy the community should be pushing towards?
I think that once you have the disease, absolutely. It is such a hot issue and so politically motivated in most cases that there's not a state wildlife agency that will touch that if they're not in a disease zone. We even have some states, such as Alabama and Arkansas, that we're still allowing baiting in their disease zones. Actually, Alabama just passed baiting, so they had not had baiting until here within the last few years, and they got it in the face of encroaching CWD. Arkansas, on the other hand, that does have it, they still have baiting in those zones. And I mean, that's certainly not from the biological end. It's not what the Arizona, Game and Fish Commission deer biologists want. I mean, that's 100% politically driven. And so there's no state that will attack that. So should you have it or should you not? Science is pretty clear that that's just simply not a good practice for our deer herds.
Yeah, and I feel like, I have friends who live and hunt in states where you can bait and that don't have CWD. And I have this conversation ad nauseum with them. I feel like they're like, well, we don't have it. If it comes, then yeah. And I'm like, you know what? How many times has CWD existed in a state long before the state knew about it? And I would postulate that it's almost every time, right? Because surveillance is so complicated and expensive and difficult that if you're not, right, if you have a neighboring state right next to you that has a super high prevalence of CWD, you're going to be investing more in surveillance. But I mean, thinking about Louisiana, the deer that was just found positive there was clinical. And to me, what that says is that deer's been sick for quite some time. And that probably there's other sick deer out there on the landscape as well that it got the disease from. So that's one of my struggles, is that the knowledge we have incomplete knowledge of the distribution of the disease, and that's continuous. That's not just today. Like, we're not going to get complete knowledge next week. So I don't know. From my personal perspective, I feel like we should just be all hands on deck, doing whatever we can to prevent it.
Yeah, that is a big scare in Louisiana with that one. And that's the thing with hunters. I say, geez, I don't find dead deer all over. So how can you tell me this is a problem? And what they need to realize is that the disease can be in a deer for, or actually the average incubation period is 18 to 24 months. So, it takes a long time before deer start showing symptoms. Once they do, they waste away very quickly. However, the whole time, that disease is eating holes in that deer's brain. So, that it just makes them far more likely to die to predators, hunters, cars, etc. So, yeah, most people will never see a deer that's clinical like they had there in Louisiana. So the fact that they did find that suggests that, yeah, that's been there a while. Um, Tennessee and Arkansas, both of those states, when they found the first case, started testing in and around those areas and then realized, wow, we have a lot of it. And in both cases, they later estimated the disease had probably been there for 10 years before they found it. So, yeah, you're absolutely right with your advice. And folks say, well, we don't have it. You don't know that you don't have it. And if you are anywhere near another state that does, there's probably a better than average chance that you do have it and you just haven't found it yet.
So I think we can just kind of, I mean, I hate to make broad generalizations, but we can kind of act like it's everywhere, right? I mean, give or take. I don't want to say that because it's not proven, but it basically is, because every time we think it's not somewhere, it pops up not too long after. But one of the other things, that I think we talked about reluctance for hunters to change their behaviors. One of the other things we see in hunters, right, and it's kind of a tradition, you pass on the smaller bucks and you let them get older, and you work up to that big, trophy class or maybe close buck, right? And we know also that CWD tends to congregate in those older, mature bucks. So how do we balance managing that, or do we need to kind of change some of those regs or traditions, or the way we go about it, or how do we balance managing that older age class buck kind of tradition in the sporting community that most folks, or a lot of folks, adhere to?
Yeah, that's a great question. Today we have arguably the most natural, or at least the oldest age structure of bucks on the landscape that we've had probably in the last 100 years. This past hunting season, of all the bucks that were shot in the U.S., 41% of them are 3.5 and older. We've been monitoring this for the past 20 years, and it's the highest percentage ever. So we have more natural age structures today, which is great, except when you have CWD. And so we know that older bucks are twice as likely to have the disease, as younger deer, or as does. So, I think this is a difficult thing for a lot of the public, because what we hear is our state wildlife agencies will say, all right, older bucks are more likely to have the disease, so let's do all we can, to keep those age structures young. And, on paper, that makes a lot of sense, but in reality, we need hunters to actually implement those plans. So we need to keep hunters engaged, actively pursuing not just bucks, but antlerless deer too. So where we often, I think, miss the message to hunters is that, yes, bucks are more likely to have the disease than antlerless deer are. However, in many cases, twice as likely. But in almost every deer population in the country, there are at least twice as many adult does out there as there are adult bucks. So even though those older bucks are more likely to have it, if you look at the sheer numbers of animals on the landscape, you almost always have more adult does that are infected than bucks. So just focusing harvest effort on bucks, I think, is a terrible mistake, because then you not only are not targeting the antlerless deer, so then deer populations rise above what they can, they start degrading habitat. And just because of the way deer live, in these groups, where any doe group you have, grandmothers and mothers and aunts and sisters, research out of Wisconsin shows that if you have one CWD positive adult doe, that all of her relatives that live near her are 10 times more likely to be positive too. It's just because of their interaction. So what we end up with then are these, reservoirs of does that are positive, which then just contribute to exacerbate this disease. So I'm not saying don't focus on bucks. What I'm saying is, hey, we can't forget about the does in this fight. We need to be harvesting from both ends. And we know nationally that only about 40% of all of our hunters will shoot one deer in any given year. So less than half of all the hunters kill a single deer. And only about 18% of hunters shoot more than one deer. So why I'm saying I think some states are focusing too much effort on bucks, as soon as they say do that, hunters kill a buck, most of them then will never ever they don't continue to hunt, and then they certainly don't harvest an antlerless deer. So deer populations rise, numbers of CWD positive animals spread, and it just makes everything worse. So I think a much more balanced approach is needed, where we tell hunters, yes, bucks are more likely to have it, but hey, here's what we need you to do. We need you, to take one of each, or in some cases where, the deer herds can withstand it. Let's make sure we harvest enough deer to be working at it from both ends, not just trying to focus all effort on bucks. Because we know that bucks make people engaged and want to go afield. So the NDA's position is, if we have some older bucks out there, it's kind of like a carrot at the end of the stick to help keep hunters engaged, supportive of CWD management efforts, continue to harvest antlerless deer as well, and do our part. Because it's very clear that we are not going to beat this disease by continuing to only have 40% of our hunters shoot a deer, and less than 20% shooting more than one in any given year.
Kip, that's such an excellent point. I feel like, so back in graduate school, I remember a specific class I took where we learned about how changing regulations influences hunter behavior. And basically it doesn't, at least like liberalizing regulations, right? So when bag limits are increased, specifically around deer, it's a rare hunter that actually goes out on the landscape and harvests more deer than they typically would anyway. If you lengthen a season, or some people will, of course, but by and large, if you're looking at from a management perspective, population level, it's not going to have a huge impact. And it's the stat that you gave about was 41% of deer hunters harvest deer.
Yeah, 40%.
40%. That's wild to me. I didn't know that. So this brings to mind one of the tools that I know managers often implement in areas where CWD has been found to achieve herd reductions, or I should say, they would like to try to implement sharpshooting or targeted removals. And I know that can be really unpalatable for hunters. I mean, you think about, you sit around all year getting ready for deer season, and then here you've got these professionals that are going to come in and just, wipe them out, basically. That's a hard pill to swallow. But there's some interesting research that was done in Missouri that showed when sharpshooters went in like post hunting season. So hunters had their chance, like they did every year, to harvest deer. Then they did targeted removals, and those specialists removed CWD positive deer at, I think, 3 times. I'm going to see how I can say this so it makes sense. Like the removals the deer that they harvested were 3 times as likely to be positive for CWD than the ones that were hunter harvested. So whether it be, they were probably able to go out there at night and use infrared and what have you, they have more tools in the toolbox, but they were much more effective at removing those infected deer from the landscape than hunters themselves were. And I feel like I can say honestly, because of my education and background related to deer, if CWD popped up where I live in my county and there were targeted removals, I would support that. But I know that somebody who doesn't have the background and the information that I have, it would be hard pressed to be excited, to even find that acceptable. So can we talk a little bit about that and kind of, I don't know. Yeah. What do you have to say about that?
No, I think that you're absolutely right. And we are fans, we being the National Deer Association, we support that selective removal and those sharpshooting programs that are particularly the ones that are done after season, after hunters have had a chance to remove as many deer as the state agency wants. They are far more likely to remove the positive animals. And we have seen examples, as you said, in Missouri. There's a great example out of Minnesota. And the best example is out of Illinois, where they can go in and do that. Illinois, the short story is they found CWD at the same time Wisconsin did. 1 to 2% prevalence rates in both. Fast forward 20 years, Illinois has always done sharpshooting and those targeted removal programs in and around areas that had the disease. Wisconsin abandoned that a long time ago. Today, in the core area of Wisconsin, there's 30 to 60% prevalence rates in those deer. In Illinois, where they have continued to do it, they're still under 10%. They're around that 5% prevalence rate. So does this work? Absolutely, it works. And even though hunters hear sharpshooting and they think, oh my gosh, all the deer are going to be gone, the reality is that's not true. It's usually a pretty small number of animals that get removed. It's just the high target probability ones that may have the disease. So you end up removing a larger number of CWD positive animals off the landscape with fewer and minimal impacts to the actual hunters out there. And in almost every case, once those deer are gone, if hunters didn't know that sharpshooting program happened, they would never even realize it, from a hunting perspective, because they're not recognizing, one fewer deer per square mile or whatever the case may be where they have. So the perception when we hear it is that, man, they are wiping the deer herd out. It's all gone. The reality of it is there's not all that many deer that are removed, but it's the high target ones that are being removed. So that absolutely helps hunters in those areas. And I'm the same way. God forbid CWD arrives in my area in Pennsylvania. If it does, I'd be the first one in line to say, yes, you're welcome to use my property after season, to be able to do this, because it really, really makes a difference for hunters, and it's in their best interest, even though the perception of it is pretty bad in many cases.
Kip, I know Ashley might still have some more hunter behavior questions for you, but we've talked about that a lot. I want to talk a little bit more about kind of the things that are outside the lines of what the hunting community might be able to do, and things like captive cervids and transportation of captive cervids and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about NDA's policies or thoughts or desires when it comes to captive cervids or interstate transport or other things that are outside the realm of what the average hunter might be able to do, or state agencies as far as hunting goes?
Sure. We think that we should stop all movement of live animals. No movement of live deer by deer farms or state wildlife agencies. And the reason for that is because we don't have a good live animal test. As we talked earlier, this disease can be prevalent in a deer for, several months, up to 2 years before they show any signs. And what that means is a lot of deer just unknowingly get moved that have the disease. And then as soon as they're moved, they take that disease with them. So there's lots of live animal tests they're in the research phase. There's tonsil biopsies, there's rectal biopsies. The rectal biopsies seem to be about the best, but unfortunately they don't work very well at all for elk. And they miss a lot of whitetails that are in the early stages of the disease. So they may have it, the test just doesn't show it, and then they end up being moved. So our stance is, hey, let's not move these deer, because we know this is the single best way to move the disease to a new area. So if we stop moving them, can we help? Absolutely. And to somebody who's not pays attention to this, they say, is this really a problem? It absolutely is. You can look at, states like Texas, Pennsylvania, and others that have the most deer farms in the country. It's crazy the number of animals that are being moved on a very regular basis. Now, we do have a national herd certification program implemented by the USDA to try to limit spread of any of these positive animals. But it's very clear that does not work, because every year deer from farms that are in that program and certified CWD free end up moving deer to other farms, in many cases across state lines, and then take that disease with them and infect new areas. So what we need to fix that program. A live animal test would solve all this, one that's reliable and practical. We're just not there yet. We just don't have it. So until that happens, we should stop all live movements of deer, and that would really help us in this fight.
I was hoping you were going to break the news to us that you had a live animal test ready to unveil. That would have been a good piece of news. All kidding aside, let's talk a little bit too about that, because the movement part, because it seems like no matter who we talk to, and on the podcast or beyond, everybody agrees. Transportation is a big issue. Live animal transportation. It seems to me like there's so much consensus about that being an issue. What are the roadblocks? I mean, it seems like we should be able to just go, boom, okay, we're done with that. It's an obvious vector. Talk about the roadblocks to making that happen.
That's mostly because while the wildlife community recognizes it as that big of an issue and that easy of a potential solution, the agriculture community does not. And the majority of deer farms in the United States are regulated through the state Department of Ag rather than the state wildlife agency. And they look at this very differently. They look at this as a commodity product, as something that's helping the economy, that's helping those rural landowners. So they don't necessarily want to see this stop. They want to see them be able to move those deer, and be compensated for that. So that's really the issue here. And the deer farmers, even though they're a pretty small group relative to hunters, they're very well connected politically, and they win the fight on almost every case because of that. So yeah, it's easy for us to say, hey, we know this issue, let's not move it. But from a deer farmer perspective, that's their livelihood, and they're very good at keeping being able to do what they do.
Yeah, honestly, it's pretty frustrating for me to be, you know, bent over, sweating, trying to debone a hindquarter before I'm gonna drive 10 miles from where I harvested this deer, and then I think about, deer farmers taking Big Jim from his pen in one state, across in a horse trailer to another to do whatever they're gonna do with them. It feels sometimes kind of futile, and like we don't have very much power to preserve this resource that we care so much about.
Yeah, and you know what? I don't want to make it sound like I'm bashing deer farmers. I know a lot of people who are in that industry, and they're good people. They're not all bad people by any means. And what I tell them is, look, we were friends, before this whole disease thing came out, and we can be friends afterwards if you want, but we'd be a lot better friends if you'd stop moving deer. If you want to keep them there, that's one thing. Just don't bring any in, and don't take any out. So there's obviously some other issues with deer that escape and fences down and all of that. But boy, the big thing is moving. If we could just stop that, we'd be miles ahead in this battle.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what average, Joe or Jane can do. What if you're just talking to somebody who knows nothing about this and they say, hey, I want to help. I'm pretty freaked out. I see the writing on the wall. This is a big problem. What should I be doing? What do you tell that person?
What we just discussed relative to, hey, support any efforts to stop live movement of any deer. That will go a long way. Make sure that you support movements on the travel restrictions for any of those high risk parts of deer that are harvested, and do if you are a hunter, make sure all of your buddies know that is restricted. You can't move those. I'm always amazed, as I travel around the U.S. for work or to hunt, and talk to people about that. How many people don't realize, what do you mean I can't move this? So that we look at it as, hey, you got your license, you got your regulations book. The fact of the matter is, there's not a lot of people that read that cover to cover. So I think every single hunter out there can help by letting their hunting buddies know what the regulations are, and make sure that they follow them. Sometimes it takes peer pressure for somebody to follow them. And if you're not a hunter, if you're a wildlife enthusiast, well, you can support your state wildlife agency's efforts at this. Continue to learn as much as you can. There are certainly some landowners that don't hunt, that have hunters hunt on their properties. Hey, make sure they're following all those rules, and doing what they can to make sure that they're not contributing to the spread of this disease.
So QDMA, which is now become a part of NDA, but back when it was QDMA, it publicly opposed multiple live deer importation bills. So we know this is something that the organization cares about and is passionate about. What do you think is the single biggest thing that NDA has done in the fight against CWD?
Certainly, the help that we have provided with Representative Kine's office to help with that legislation, that would be an absolute game changer. If that passes, and we have that funding available to the states to really be able to manage this, and monitor it. Also, we have worked with several grant foundations and with several state wildlife agencies to help increase capacity for testing. That's one of the biggest bottlenecks is, we encourage hunters, if you're in a disease zone, get your animal tested. The state wildlife agency needs the results of that so they can measure prevalence rate of the disease and rate of spread. But also, don't eat that deer, until you receive a satisfactory test. The problem is the turnaround times, anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks in many places that somebody has to wait, and that's simply because capacity for testing is just way too low. So anybody who's business minded and, as an entrepreneur absolutely has a good opportunity here, to be able to increase, labs, that do this. We have great equipment for this. We just need more of it. It doesn't take that long to run a sample. Most of that turnaround time is waiting between you when you drop that head off and it gets to the person to run the sample, and then you actually get the result back. So, we could have results back, within a day, if we had increased capacity for testing. So we talk about that on a regular basis. We help, have helped increase capacity in different states, and we will keep trying to increase that so that hunters don't have to wait so long before they get those results. That allows them to just be more responsible with either consuming or donating that, as well as making the decision to have it tested in the first place.
Let me ask one more little hypothetical question, Kip. With all your experience looking back over the progression of the disease over all these different states, what's the one thing you would have done or you think just across the board should have been done differently? And, maybe what lesson that teaches us as we move forward?
I think that initially some states took too hard of a stance against this relative to eradication of the deer. We will never, ever beat this without hunter involvement. And I firmly believe that we need more or better working relationships between hunters and landowners and our state wildlife agencies than ever before to be able to beat this. And early on, there were some pretty hard lines drawn by some state wildlife agencies that really separated hunters from that and got it so that they weren't working together. And I think we lost a lot of time in this fight because of it. So I think more states today are doing a far better job sharing information with hunters and then working with them more as partners rather than a supervisor kind of an employee relationship. And I think that engagement is paying dividends and is helping now. So if we could go back and do it all over again, I think if we had that better relationship early on, we would be a little bit farther ahead today.
Wise words, Kip. Wise words. I think the example you gave earlier between Wisconsin and Illinois or Iowa, Illinois.
Yep, Illinois.
Yeah, that illustrates that really well. What can happen differently. Well, is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
I think it's just to make sure that folks are aware, hey, there's a lot of resources out here and places that they can go to continue learning. A lot of state wildlife agencies have good websites. Certainly our CWD Resource Center at the National Deer Association is a great source for folks. We try to always provide things that they can do, whether it's videos that they can watch or information they can read. But I don't think that this is grim. I think I am a firm believer that we are going to beat this. And the more people, whether they hunt or not, that get involved and do their part with this, I think the more quickly we will beat it. So that's the way we look at it. We certainly don't feel that all is lost. We're well in this fight, and by the end of this, we're going to come out on top. So I think we need to keep that optimistic attitude toward this, because as soon as we give up, all is lost, and deer and all wildlife are just far too important to give up. So I'd encourage them to go and learn all they can and be able to do their part.
I like it. That. Glass half full. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. We need a dose of optimism these days, or always. Thank you, Kip.
Yeah. Well, Kip, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I think we've got a lot of great takeaways here, and I hope that our listeners feel like, this episode was really about them. It was for them even more than the other episodes have been, because we're hunters too. Like we care about this from that perspective as well. So thank you for all of your insight.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And thank you for what you guys do to help inform sportsmen and women on this topic and everything else. And I've had a good time today. So thank you.
Cheers, Kip. Take care.
Yeah. And stay tuned for our next episode in the series. The Chronic Wasting Disease Chronicles.
a production of NWF Outdoors and Artemis.